Now let's take a look at the roots of American government, because it's obvious that the founders of our nation, the authors of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they didn't just wake up one morning with this incredible new idea of self-rule democracy in their heads. There were roots that go way back in our history that lead us to the kinds of governments and the kind of political philosophies that we adhere to now in the United States. And the roots of American government really begin with two events. One, the Reformation, and the other, the Enlightenment. The Reformation was a religious movement, and the Enlightenment was an intellectual and philosophical movement. And they both were important in the formation of the ideas that lead to our U.S. Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, and the types of government that we have today. They're very important, both the Reformation and the Enlightenment, because they both rejected something called the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings. And here's what the divine right of kings is. It's a circular argument that allows kings to uh, persuade their subjects to accept their rule. Every leader, whether they be a dictator, a king, a president, whatever, they crave legitimacy. And legitimacy just means that they want their subjects to accept them as their leader. If you're a legitimate leader, that means you are accepted and you have a right to be there. And you want the public to and your subjects to accept your leadership. Well, the idea of the divine right of kings basically says this: the king, of course, this idea of divine right of kings comes out of the Middle Ages, and in the Middle Ages, the you know 1400s, 1300s, 1400s, those centuries, where the church was really the most important uh, institution in Western Europe, in the European theater, if you will. So the church was very important. Most people were illiterate. Only religious leaders were literate. Uh, the Pope, cardinals, priests, and so they were the only ones that could read the Bible, and so they interpreted the Bible for the masses, and they told the masses what the Bible meant. And therefore the masses were beholden to their knowledge, the knowledge of the elite, the knowledge of the those that could read. So the kings knew that, and the kings knew that these religious subjects were generally superstitious and um, and uh, and were and very religious. So they would argue this. They would say, "Look, as you know, and what the priests tell you, and what the Pope tells you, is that God exists, God is infallible, and God controls everything." And then they would say, if I am king. Now, if I am king and God controls everything and God is infallible, then God must want me to be king. And by definition, kings rule over their subjects, and the subjects must follow the rules of the king. Therefore, if you, as my subject, defy me and do not follow what I say, aren't you actually defying God? Aren't you actually rejecting the rule of God and the Word of God? Therefore, if you don't accept me as your legitimate ruler and do what I say, you're rejecting God, and you will basically go to hell. And this was the divine right of kings. This was the argument that kings made. Okay, now both the Reformation, as I said, which was a religious movement, and the Enlightenment, which was an intellectual and philosophical movement, both rejected this idea. They both said, no, 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 no. This is not how leaders should legitimize their rule. Now, the Reformation was a religious movement, and it began with the Protestant split from the Church of England. And one of the things the Protestants argued, and this it leads to the rejection of the divine right of kings, is that people could have a personal relationship with God. You did not need the church to tell you uh, what your relationship with God was, what it took to be saved, or you know, they didn't need, according to the Reformation, you didn't need an intermediary such as a priest or a cardinal or a bishop or a pope. Okay, of course, if you say these types of things in the 15, 16, 1700s, you are going to be persecuted by the establishment uh, of the Church of England and other and the Catholic Church. So the Puritans flee. They run around the world a little bit and end up on the shores of the New World. Uh, and when the Puritans land at Plymouth, they basically the first thing they do is, of course, establish their churches. And these churches they establish with something called self-governing congregations. Self-governing congregations. This basically they're saying instead of the top-down hierarchy where the Pope, the bishops, the cardinals determine who the leadership will be in each individual Catholic church, the Puritans, Protestants, the congregation themselves choose their leaders, choose their own rules, uh, determine things for themselves. And so they're self-governing, much like a self-governing government where people vote for their leaders and vote for the policies that they want to implement. The church did this as well. And while it was specifically isolated to the church, these self-governing congregations, they it planted the seeds for the later concepts and the future concepts of governmental self-rule, governmental self-determination. Uh, so the Reformation. Now the Enlightenment was an intellectual and philosophical movement, which I spoke of, and the Enlightenment. These were just really smart, literate people who looked at the world and said, you know what? We don't need the priest or the church telling us how the world works or or why things happen. We can figure it out for ourselves through human reason, through logic, through thinking. And So the Enlightenment thinkers basically believed in human reason. They believed in science, the scientific method, and well, I'm gonna have to stop. So the fundamental ideas that are at the root of American government, of course, come from the Enlightenment and the Reformation. But there are some other ideas that are also important to our American government and and the formation of it. First, Hobbes and Locke. Hobbes and Locke, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, both agreed, although they had different reasons to kind of agree with this. They both agreed that government is necessary. Okay, that it makes our life better, it protects us from each other, and it just creates a more peaceful and uh, pleasant world to live in if you have government to kind of control people's behaviors and to set rules, societal rules by which we live. Another philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, came up with this idea called social contract theory. And basically, his idea is that people come together in a society for the purpose of creating a better world. Uh, but, he said, there are problems with government. And of course, Hobbes touches on this, and Locke especially touches on this as well. But there are problems with government. Governments inherently repress those natural born rights that Locke talked about, life, liberty, and property. So, because governments, especially monarchies or totalitarian governments, they can repress those natural born rights. The only legitimate leaders come from the consent of those who are being governed. So, the only way a leader can be legitimate is if those people who he or she rules over consents to be governed, meaning they agree to be governed. I will let you make rules to govern me, is basically what the people would say if there is legitimate authority. And in return, of course, it's a contract. So in return, once we give them that power, we say, okay, you can make rules. We will follow those rules as long as they don't infringe on those natural born rights. Also, according to Rousseau, the people are sovereign. Okay, according to social contract theory, the people are sovereign, meaning in the end, they have the final say as to all matters. Okay, the people are sovereign. They're the only ones that can determine for themselves what types of government they have, who will be part of that government, and if the governments that they've chosen do not work for them or violate their natural rights, they're sovereign, so they have the power to change them. Uh, the sovereign government should consider society to have certain public concerns and the common good. So, sovereign government should consider society to have certain public concerns. So there are certain things that society must be able to do, meaning the group of people that that are necessary to have a productive, safe society. But they also there are common goods that tie in with this, where you know there are things that maybe infringe on individual rights, but because they're for the common good, they would override some individual rights, though there are not many of those. But and here's maybe the real crux of what Rousseau is getting at, especially with regard to American political thought, is that people maintain their freedoms unless they conflict with the common good. This is a fundamental thing we talk about, and it's a fundamental issue that we deal with, every day in government. You know, people maintain their freedoms. You can do whatever you want to until you cross the line and it threatens or conflicts or challenges what is best for the society as a whole. And you can talk about many, many, many different policies or many, many different actions of individuals. Some people may claim it doesn't infringe with the common good. Others claim maybe it does. And that goes back to ideology and whether, the role of government and the role of the person. It goes back to your own religious beliefs. Uh, you know, uh, People think that some people would argue that, like something a current event type issue like gay marriage, that while that's personal freedom, it might conflict with the common good. uh, Others would argue that, uh, pure free enterprise is pure freedom, but others would argue that that conflicts with the common good because it's a selfish enterprise or whatever. So there's many different things that could be considered personal freedoms that some could argue conflict with the common good. And that's the purpose of our government and the purpose of debate and the purpose of the legislatures is to kind of come to a compromise and come to a reasoned reckoning of what freedoms don't conflict with the common good and what freedoms do, and therefore which of our freedoms through laws, because we know all laws limit freedoms, which laws are legitimate and which are not. So with all these philosophical ideas floating around, we had people show up at the shores of the New World, the Americas, and create their colonies, their communities, and most all of them had local participation. There was some form of democratic participation in all of the newly established settlements. Okay. But then, of course, those grew into larger, more organized, oftentimes um, colony-wide type governmental units and representative units. So early on, you had the Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619. It was the first representative colonial legislature in American history, or at least in the New World. So the Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619, was the first representative colonial government. Of course, New England also had their town hall meetings, which were basically representative councils that took care of the issues of the day for localities, not colony wide. Like there wasn't a town hall for Massachusetts as a whole, but there would maybe a town hall for Plymouth or later Boston or whatever. Uh, and the thing we have to remember here too, as in our relationship, all of these people who came over in Virginia and in New England, they were British subjects. They were part of England. They were English citizens and were loyal to the British Crown, loyal to the King. So, but as they began to establish themselves over here in the colonial, uh, during the colonial period in the colonies, there was very little royal interference. Okay, they kind of let them do what they want over in the colonies. All they asked is that they paid, tariffs, taxes on trade, and that was really the only uh, revenue that was required by England. One thing that England did not do, and this was very, very important to understanding why there was a revolution later against England, is that England did not directly tax the colonists, meaning they did not tax the colonists on their property that they owned in the colonies. England did not tax purchases at the local general store in the colonies. Uh, Now, that doesn't mean that the colonists did not pay taxes, but they were not taxed by Great Britain or by England or by the Parliament or by the King. They taxed themselves because they knew, and all governments know, you have to have money and resources to run the government. So what would happen is these local councils, these town hall meetings, these legislative councils that were established by the communities would tax themselves. They would say, okay, at the town hall meeting, they would be a vote. Okay, we're going to tax, a 1% tax on all tea bought in the local stores. And so that's how they would raise money. But what wasn't happening is England was not directly taxing them. Uh, England made their money through an economic system, basically called mercantilism. And and the idea of mercantilism is that a nation or an empire, but a nation really, increased its national wealth by promoting domestic industry through favorable trade balance. Here's the way it works. Back then, back in the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s, the common knowledge at the time was that there was only a finite amount of wealth in the world. There was only so much gold, so much silver, so much money. And therefore, if you as a nation wanted to be richer, then you had to sell more goods from other countries than you bought. Just like you as a person, if you want to become richer and increase your wealth, you save more than you buy. You make more money than you spend. Okay? Same thing here. You want to have a favorable trade balance as a nation, meaning you want to sell more goods that you make domestically in your country to other countries, therefore getting their wealth into your country. You want to sell more than you buy from other countries, because when you buy something from other countries, you're giving them money for a finished product. So mercantilism is basically this idea that the only way a nation can become wealthier is if they sell more than they buy. Therefore, it's imperative in this system that you produce things in your country to sell, that you produce finished goods. You have domestic industry that makes things. Of course, the problem is that to make things, you usually need raw materials, and raw materials are always not always plentiful in your country. So sometimes you have to go elsewhere to get the raw materials. And of course, if you buy raw materials from another country, you're sending money out, and it violates the principles of mercantilism. So what Great Britain and other nations did in order to make sure they had access to raw materials for their domestic industry, while also protecting their wealth, they would basically colonize the places around the world that had the raw materials they wanted. So if you're a shipbuilding nation like Great Britain was, or England was, and you needed quality lumber to build those ships, the New World had quality lumber. Okay. If another nation controlled the New World, then you would have to pay for that quality lumber. You'd have to give them your money to have the raw materials to build your ships. And that's money going out. And you don't want that. So you colonize the New World, and you have access to that, to those raw materials. Now you're still paying for it. You're still paying your colonists for the raw materials. But what England did to ensure that the money stayed within their empire, they passed something called the Navigation Acts. And basically it restricted trade of the colonists to where they could only buy most finished goods from England. Because if colonists bought finished goods, products that they wanted from France or Portugal or some other nation, that's money going out of the empire, and you don't want to do that. So the Navigation Acts basically uh, were trade restrictions on colonies to promote mercantilism, to promote growth in national wealth, and it basically prevented the colonists or told the colonists not to buy things from other countries, only buy from England whenever possible. The only problem is the colonies are the Atlantic Ocean away from England, very difficult to enforce with all the ports and coastlines of the New World, of the east coast of what is now the United States. And so it was difficult to enforce, and also it was resented by the colonists because the colonists may get better deals from other countries. They may get better quality products from other countries, and they didn't like the idea that England was telling them what they could buy and where they could buy it. So they were ignored, and and it was called statutory neglect. England knew that it was being ignored, but they really didn't have the resources to do anything about it. They just kind of just sloughed it off. So this was a situation early on in American colonial history. You had the colonies growing very quickly. They had established representative governments, and the British government, the Parliament and the King, kind of ignored them, let them kind of develop on their own, let them create their own type of institutions, their own norms of society, their own economic norms. And one of those economic norms that they created was this idea of they only tax themselves, that Great Britain did not directly tax them. Um, and then something fundamentally changed everything in the middle of the 1700s. Now, by the middle of the 1700s, the colonies had existed for almost 150 years. Okay, they had been there a long time, and they had been left alone for 150 years. And so, but what was happening is they were running out of land, really, to settle in the area along the eastern seaboard of the United States that we now think of as, Virginia, New York, Maine, South Carolina, whatever. Um, so they're running out of space. So they began moving westward over the boundary that we will call the um, Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains, and I'll show you a map of the Appalachian Mountains here in just a moment. But they started crossing over, and it was in this area where uh, the Indians had been displaced to. Of course, the Indians had controlled all the land along the eastern seaboard of the colonies until the colonists showed up, and as they continued to migrate, immigration continued from England and from Europe. It forcibly pushed the Indians deeper into the woods until finally they were pressed up against the Appalachian Mountains, which run kind of parallel to the eastern seaboard, and then finally they were pushed over to the other side. And during this time, the colonists would always say, "You just move a little bit farther westward, and we'll leave you alone." And the Indians would be like, "Well, we don't want to, but we really have no choice because we can't really resist the onslaught and the flood of immigrants coming in." So finally, they moved over to across the Appalachian Mountains, further into the heart of what is now the United States, and they developed a very very good relationship with French traders there. You had French traders who were protected by some, French military outposts, and there was a very good relationship because the Indians had a much better relationship with the French because the French weren't there to establish permanent colonies that were going to inevitably grow to cities. They were just there to trade. Okay, they were just there to trade, and the French military posts that were set up were simply there to protect the traders. But as land became scarce for British settlers, they began to move into this territory that was being occupied by the French and the Indians. And so a war began over this. Of course, there was a broader war in Europe. The French and the British were always fighting wars in Europe, and this was just kind of a spillover. And so the French and Indian War began, also called the 7 Years' War for testing purposes, either the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. And it lasted between 1756 and 1763. So the war was fought, and the colonists, alongside the British military, the Redcoats, finally defeated the French and the Indians. And this is where everything kind of fundamentally changes, because the British, once the war was over, they kind of took a long, hard look at their relationship with the colonies, and they decided that it wasn't working out the way they had thought. So they changed their policies toward the colonies. The British, once the war was over, changed their policies towards the colonies. They basically said, "You guys started this war. You're the ones that moved it over into the French and Indian territory where they were peaceably living, and you started this war. So you are going uh, to pay for the war. Also, because you kept going over there, and that was the reason, we're going to now limit your ability to do that. You are going to need explicit permission." Now they're telling, this is the Parliament and the King telling this to the colonists. You're going to need explicit permission to settle territory on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. That was the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 basically stated that there will be no more settlement in what's called the Ohio Valley, um, or Northwest Territory, or whatever you want to call it, uh, without explicit permission from Parliament. Okay. Also, they said these wars are expensive. Just like today, wars are expensive. Back then, wars are expensive. So, because the war was your fault, colonists, the British said, we're going to have you pay for the war. And the way we're going to have you pay for the war is to directly tax you. Remember that one thing that the colonists never had to do was pay direct taxes to Great Britain? Well, now they're going to have to. So they're going. The British are going to begin directly taxing the colonists for the cost of the war and for the administration of the colonies. Okay, paying for the government. So they implemented a couple of taxes: the sugar tax, stamp tax, and Quartering Act of 1765. Quartering Act's not really a tax; it was just a policy that said that the colonists must provide housing for British soldiers who are over in the colonies. Now, the stamp tax was an important one because it was a tax on all official documents used in the colonies, and so this directly impacted the business leaders, those that had that were most influential and most capable of fomenting resistance to these new policies. And so, with these new taxes and with the Quartering Act, protests began in the colonies, especially right around the Boston area in New England. That was kind of the hotbed for protests. But protests began. People began questioning British policy and questioning the British's right to tax them in this way. Okay, this map shows the proclamation line of 1763. That purple line is basically the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, and that it was that mountain range that was being crossed over continuously, or at least it's not exactly the mountain range, but it kind of runs roughly along it. But that was going to be the new border where the colonists could no longer cross over without British consent. Uh, and of course, you can see that many of these areas have already, the dark green area, the settlements had already butted up against the mountains, and it was in these areas, like in Maryland and in Virginia, that they began spilling over into this French and Indian territory until the war. Of course, once the war was won, in 1763, that became British territory. So as we said, there began to be protests, and and for the first time, really, these colonies, they were very different when they were first established. They had different uh, religious norms. Their societies were different, especially the differences between the New England societies and the southern colonies. The New England colonies were more nuclear family, smaller farms. By nuclear family, I mean like a mother, father, and children, and very religious in New England. The southern colonies less religious, fewer nuclear families. The economy was a plantation slave economy. In New England, it was more, there were slaves in New England, but there just weren't as many, and you didn't have the agricultural economic necessity to have slaves in New England. But anyway, so they're very different. And they didn't have a whole lot in common, but they did have in common one thing, and this: they didn't like these new taxes. So all these disparate colonies, not all of them, but 9 of the 13, came together in 1765 for something that would be called the Stamp Act Congress. They met in New York City, and basically they said, okay, what what is it that we don't like about what Great Britain's doing to us? And so there was all these grievances. Mainly, it was about the taxation problem, about being directly taxed. And so they sent a list of grievances to Parliament and to the King in England. And basically, the gist of it was, and this is that famous thing you learned in middle school, hopefully, that little reminder of what their complaint was, is no taxation without representation. And basically, what that means is that they felt like that if they were going to be taxed, if the government of Great Britain was going to be tax them and take their property, their money, then they should have representatives in Parliament in England from the colonies. But there were no colonial representatives in Parliament to argue their side of the case. It was a separate government across the ocean that was taking away their money without their consent. Okay, and if you go back to the philosophies of Locke and Rousseau, you can't do that. That violates their natural born rights to their property. Remember life, liberty, and property? Property is money. And you can only have your property taken, according to Locke and Rousseau, you can only have your property taken by your own consent. And with no representatives of the colonies in Parliament in England, the colonists felt like they were not able to give their consent. So it was taxation without representation. And this became the rallying cry. And so with the rise in protests, more British troops were sent to New England, and the tensions rose. On March 5th, 1770, you had a Boston Massacre, which was the first real bloodshed of the disagreement between the British and the colonies. 1772, the Committee of Correspondence is formed, and basically each colony had, and in each major community in each colony had this committee that would, if anything dealing with the British came about that they felt was important enough to share, they were required to pass that information by horseback or whatever along to the next colony, and the next colony would pass it along to the next colony. And it created a communication system, which would come in really handy once that communication system would be already established once the revolution started. Then the Tea Act of 1773 was passed, which basically was the British trying to bail out a failed tea company. The East India Tea Company was going bankrupt, and it had investors in it in Parliament, and so they were looking for ways to save their investment. So basically they said, okay, colonists, we're going to pass this tea act that says you can only buy tea from this one tea company. And tea was, of course, a very popular drink in the colonies. And while the tea wasn't overpriced, I mean, it was competitively priced, and they weren't being charged more than they should have been for the tea. The colonists didn't like the idea of being forced to buy tea from a specific company by the government. So in retaliation, they dressed up, some rebels dressed up as Indians, boarded one of the ships that was carrying the tea, and dumped the tea over into Boston Harbor, later known as the Boston Tea Party. That was kind of the last straw for Great Britain and for the Parliament. They passed the Coercive Acts of 1774 after the Boston Tea Party, also called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts, and they basically shut down Boston Harbor, blockaded it until all that tea was paid for, and they implemented a new Quartering Act, because they were going to be sending new troops to the colonies. So a new Quartering Act, which basically said that colonists must provide housing for all British troops, even if it means placing British troops in private homes, which that did not go over well. Imagine if you were a colonist, and you had a home, and you had a wife and 2 daughters, and all of a sudden Great Britain is telling you that you're going to have British troops living with you with your wife and children. That was very offensive to the colonists. But the point is, though, that everything, the tension is being ratcheted up here. The Coercive Acts and the protests will become much more intense.